thank you so much for having us here today. We are going to be talking about topics related to equity and infrastructure, covering Justice 40, broadband, water drainage infrastructure, and more. I'm Annie Decker. My title is Chief of Legal, Planning, and Regulatory Affairs at the Department of Energy and Environmental Protection. And with me today are two amazing panelists. We have Lisa Morrissey, who is the Deputy Commissioner of the Connecticut Department of Public Health, where she oversees the Environmental Health and Drinking Water Branch, the Office of Public Health Preparedness, the Office of Health Equity, the Office of Climate Change and Health, Community Family Health and Prevention Branch, and the Office of Firearm Injury Prevention. Lisa has previously served as the Director of Health for Bridgeport, Danbury, New Milford, and the Housatonic Valley Health District, as well as the towns of Sharon and Washington. Her strategic leadership is demonstrated through her development of public health programs that focus on population health, disease prevention, community health improvement, and addressing health disparities. She holds 1 million graduate degrees and distinctions and has a career-long commitment to advancing public health outcomes through innovative partnerships and interventions. And then turning to our second panelist, which is asking for my Face ID right here, we have Alexis Bivens, who is the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives for the Connecticut Council for Philanthropy and the Managing Director of the Supporting Organizing Work Funders Collaborative, which is a project supported by the Council. Alexis joined the Council team with over 15 years of experience in philanthropic organizations and nonprofits. She most recently served as Program Director at the Emily Hall Tremaine Foundation, where she spearheaded initiatives focusing on the environment and learning differences. Before joining the foundation, she was the Director of Thrive by 25 at Fairfield County's Community Foundation. She has worked at the McGivney Community Center in Bridgeport as their Executive Director. She also has worked there as the Executive Director, and she also has, 1 million degrees as well in relevant fields. So thank you so much for joining us on this panel. So to do a bit of context setting, who in this room is familiar with Justice 40? Okay, so we don't have to do too much context setting then. But as you might know, the Justice 40 initiative from the Biden-Harris administration made it a goal that 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal climate, clean energy, affordable, and sustainable housing and other investments flow to disadvantaged communities. These are specifically communities that are marginalized by underinvestment and overburdened by pollution. The goal is to align federal resources to these areas. The definition at the federal level has a lot of overlap with the definition in Connecticut. Primarily in Connecticut, we look to Connecticut General Statutes 22A, 20A, which defines an EJ community in two ways, either as low-income census block groups or as membership in what's called a distressed municipality in Connecticut, which is a label that is provided by the by DECD, Department of Economic and Community Development. And it changes every year. There's some shifts, so you can go online to the DECD website to get the latest list of distressed municipalities. So that's how Connecticut generally defines an EJ community. So Connecticut is benefiting and will benefit from much of this funding through Justice 40, and many of these dollars can flow through DEEP, DPH, and many other agencies here today. At DEEP, to give you a sort of snapshot, our work includes conservation and protection of natural resources and making cheaper, cleaner, and more reliable energy for state residents and businesses. Funding from IRA and bill, so these major federal infrastructure laws, has been and continues to be instrumental in DEEP's ability to implement our greenhouse gas emission goals and our commitment to EJ communities. So I'll just highlight a few initiatives and then turn to our speakers, but that demonstrate how this federal funding has been instrumental in helping us to expand our work in EJ communities. So DEEP was awarded $1 million from EPA's Environmental Justice Government to Government grant to assist communities in responding to the ongoing sewer flooding challenges in Hartford. And this funding is being awarded to a coalition of neighborhood and community organizations such as Hartford Next, Blue Hills Civic Association, and the Keeney Park Sustainability Project. And the City of Hartford and the Friends of Keeney Park are providing support. The north end of Hartford, as you might know, experiences chronic sewer backups in homes and businesses. So far, the state has committed more than $170 million to implement a pilot program that will address sewage overflows in streets and basements in North Hartford. Also, in June of this year, DEEP approved $82 million in grants, 46 of which are new construction projects on the Federal Clean Water Fund priority list to continue our support of this pilot over the next 2 years. We share this story because it highlights all the necessary components of funding and flexibility that might be required to achieve the state's goals around infrastructure with EJ communities. So the need to engage with communities and ensuring that there are trusted members of the community who are in turn sharing information back with the agency and with their communities. So turning to our speakers, big picture, and I'm going to sit down, and you all are mic'd, right?
Yes.
Let's see. So for Deputy Commissioner Morrissey, oh, right there I have a mic. Okay, great. Can you tell us about Connecticut's long-term vision for public health, especially in relation to equity and environmental justice, and any key legislative or policy drivers?
Thank you, Annie. And it's a pleasure to be here with everyone today. You know, I actually came to DPH in 2022, so my 2-year anniversary is just about here. And, you know, one of the things that happened when we came in, I came in right at the right time, because we had this massive investment that we had from Bill funding that we had to get out, and really had to think about how are we going to prioritize, how are we going to strategize around there, because it was a monumental challenge for us. We were talking about an agency that, you know, for our water infrastructure projects, and anywhere, you know, between $20 and $30 million we would have available in a given year, to now we have almost $750 million in like funding to do various water infrastructure projects. And one of the things that was quickly apparent was that what we needed to really think about was how are we going to strategize moving this funding out in an equitable way into communities, and that also required us to rethink what the definition of a distressed community, so using the DEC definition of that and expanding upon that, and lessons learned coming out of COVID-19 about marginalized communities, and really looking to expand. So now we have about 13 different metrics that we look at to define what makes a distressed or disadvantaged community. And, you know, part of that piece and really being able to maximize the potential impact of this funding required us to think about our legislative agenda. And what you've seen from DPH and what you'll continue to see is that we have a lot of thematic pieces that are happening. And so coming up next, looking at a lot of our statutes and regs around water, how we can get money out, how communities address water infrastructure. There's some really large looming things that are out there in communities. So how do we address PFAS? How do we address you know, lead service lines and all of these pieces that communities have to think about. And even if you kind of think about most recently in August with, you know, the flooding that we saw in some communities, rebuilding a lot of the damage that happened to the water infrastructure. And so our legislative agenda and our funding and how we're moving that is really related to how do we get the most impact, how do we work with our other sister agencies, and how do we work with community organizations that are making investments in communities so that we're all maximizing the amount of funding that's available to communities.
Great. Is there one of those projects that you are most excited about?
Most excited about. So I had the good fortune recently. New London has an amazing lead service line project that they've been doing. So I don't know if anyone here is from the New London area or happened to be out there. Now, what I consider exciting, I have to tell you that like sometimes I get angry letters from constituents. They're tearing up my roads. What are you guys doing at the state tearing up the roads? But we're in communities. We're making these investments in communities. So New London, for example, they were able to utilize funding from the state revolving fund, where they receive loan funding. They also receive subsidy funding. They're getting bond funding to go into their community. They're pulling up, they're opening up the streets, taking the lead service lines out of the roads. They're knocking on doors in their community to go right to the residents, right to their homes and say, hey, can we go look in your basement? Do you have lead pipes down there? We'd like to get them out. I mean, and that's really exciting to me, because that's a huge investment in creating lead-safe environments, and that's just one of the projects. I mean, and there's so many like that that are really exciting. Now, what will happen is when it happens in my neighborhood and then my road's torn up, then I might be a different story about how exciting that is, right, when you have those disruptions. But it truly is an amazing experience to see, particularly, like I said, that these are coming out. And then I had the opportunity recently to talk with the Manchester Public Water Service company over there, and they told me that they actually they still found some wood water service lines in their community. So the last couple of them, they just took out wood. And I was just like, you have wood in the ground that's 150 years old that's carrying water? I am very happy to make this investment. This is a project that the state can get behind. So those are some of the exciting projects that we've seen.
To ask a bit more about lead, and I actually worked on lead paint litigation when I lived in California, and that was more actually suing the former lead paint companies for knowingly, continuing to produce the paint for decades. And we won $1 billion for the state of California to remediate some lead hazards, but of course the actual costs are far more than that. But are you finding in Connecticut that the lead lines are still are disproportionately remain in lower income or communities of color, or is it is it across the state without sort of disparity? That's
a great question. So let's talk about that for a second. So the first thing that I would say is that we've been surprised. It's a pleasant surprise that there's far less lead than I think that we had planned for. So when we started talking about this 2 years ago when I came to the agency, because the go live was actually just last month, October 2024 is when those lead service line inventories were due into DPH. And what we've been finding is there's less lead in Connecticut than we thought as far as the lead service lines. And where we're finding it, we found it, we're seeing it in New Haven, we're seeing it in Bridgeport, we saw it in Waterbury area, but we're also seeing it in small communities in eastern Connecticut. So the communities that are designated as disadvantaged are the ones that we're more likely to find it in, but it hasn't been an urban problem, it hasn't been a rural problem, it's been a community where we're seeing that there hasn't been the financial opportunity to make those infrastructure investments is where we're finding it.
Okay, yeah. So I know with paint there's more of a disparity, maybe a clear disparity by...
Yeah, so when we're talking about paint, the interesting thing about when we talk about children with elevated blood lead levels, more often than not, paint is implicated. And then here in Connecticut communities, disproportionately, 10 municipalities carry 60% of the burden of children with elevated blood lead levels. That's attributed to lead paint.
Okay, great. All right, turning to Alexis. Could you tell us a little bit about your organization's role in addressing environmental justice and infrastructure? So, for example, looking at individual versus community-based solutions and using philanthropy to augment and partner with the state of Connecticut?
Yeah, sure, Annie. Thank you so much for having me here to talk about philanthropy. So the Connecticut Council for Philanthropy is a membership organization. We are the membership organization in Connecticut for our philanthropic individuals and organizations that really just want to get to social impact and doing good in the community. And our role at the council is to really help them think through best practices and strategies and equip them with tools and help them connect with one another and partner and make sure, quite honestly, that all areas of our state are covered, whether it's rural communities, suburban communities, small towns. I'd love to kind of hear that the last panel panel talk about the small town needs, really important. We have philanthropy everywhere in Connecticut. So I encourage folks to really think about making connections to folks that are leading philanthropic institutions in your community. We have community foundations, we have corporate foundations, we have family foundations, and every single issue that came up on this panel today, there's a funder that cares about that. So I just want to say that up front for you all. And then for the Connecticut Council for Philanthropy, we're very much interested in helping to think about money and solutions together with the state. The state has money, philanthropy has money. We share a lot of the same goals, and we are talking about the same communities, so it's really important that we figure out ways to get to shared agendas, leveraging what one another does. Philanthropy is really good at things like first dollars in for a pilot. They're really good at taking an idea and staying with it year over year. They're really good about bringing other funders together to kind of think about what we can do, learning from other states. I mean, lots of ways that philanthropy is interested in working with government. I think convening and learning alongside is another way that philanthropy uses its muscle the best, is really to have open conversations, because we're informed by community. A lot of what we do is directly from community, is from what nonprofits are saying, it's from what grassroots groups are saying. Environmental justice crosses each and every topic, so we are talking about water and housing, we are talking about workforce and transportation, we are talking about all of these pieces in very real ways and working to get to solutions. So when we have opportunities like this to talk to commissioners and hear about plans and hear about how you all are putting together applications and how you're leaning into listening to community, we want to be a part of that. You know, justice is something that philanthropy has been really building its muscle to understand. Justice and equity. You know, our 2020 triple pandemic, quadruple pandemic, however you're counting that, really did a spotlight on how we can really think about the communities we care most about, the folks that have been underinvested in year over year, time over time, you know, initiative after initiative, and how do we stop and take a beat and really do what we need to do to get to more equitable and just communities across our 169 communities in the state. And then last thing I'll say, from where I sit, I have been born and raised in Connecticut. I work here, I live here, I play here, I do all the things here, and one thing, my training has kind of got me to think about micro level stuff all the way to macro, right? You know, we have to think about every individual in the context of a community, in the context of our state. So I think philanthropy does that really well, really thinks about what are the local actions that can really lead to some statewide. Can we pilot something here that might be great for other rural communities? Can we think about, you know, workforce issues with our transportation providers, right? Like those types of conversations, philanthropy is really interested in. One formula that I like to take with me is we have to do two things. We have to organize people and we have to organize money. And that's how you get to change. So if you are working, sometimes you're working with really organized people and have no money. Sometimes you have money and have to figure out a way to organize people. So a role that philanthropy is really used to and comfortable with and has really good success stories around how do you do that and do that well where you are bringing everyone along.
Can you speak a bit to how the large foundations versus small foundations are addressing equity and justice and sort of areas where you think they could be doing more?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think no matter what the size, I think philanthropy is starting to understand the power of collaboration in a way that really does get us to greater impact. The Connecticut Council for Philanthropy hosts all types of funder collaboratives. Folks have affinity groups. We have a workforce development affinity group, housing, early childhood. You mentioned the supporting organizing work. That is thinking about the infrastructure needs for communities and grassroots groups. So one of our early panels asks, who has experience with federal applications? Right? Groups are not comfortable there. They're not comfortable. They don't know what to do. Sometimes they're small nonprofits. They're not sure what to do, but they have ideas. They have plans. They have the ear of the community to really inform. So I think there's such an opportunity for collaboration, big foundations, small foundations. You start to put together your areas of expertise. Sometimes it's about commissioning more data. Sometimes it's looking at data very intentionally. Sometimes it's about working with our commissioners and our different departments to think about your goals and how can we support them because we believe in them, right? So I think that there's room for everyone, whether you have a few dollars or big dollars. I think the danger is going it alone, always. So just really thinking through those opportunities for matching or reimbursements, and how can folks who have different expertise really help to bring this idea together so we can accelerate it, because I think on both sides, and just to be very candid and honest, philanthropy can be slow too. You know, we can be slow, we can have some bureaucracy as well. So it may take us a while, but the more that we're thinking through and working with partners and being able to get to examples quickly, the better we all are for it.
So when we think about somewhat slow philanthropy and then somewhat slow sometimes state agencies, not always, but do you think that combination, when is that combination a good one and when is that combination a sort of frustrating one? Mm-hmm. And can you think of any sort of positive examples of collaboration with state agencies?
Yeah, well, I'll give you a very fresh one that feels important to me. So about a year ago, the federal EPA put out a grant opportunity, and Connecticut is considered a part of Region 1. I'm like, okay, that's something to know. Philanthropy, we're not paying attention in that way. So we're part of Region 1. That was something to know. That was first step for philanthropy. To know that there are, when we think about attracting money to our state, that sometimes some departments think they have all different ways of thinking about how we do that. Mm-hmm. So that was one thing. And with that, there was a whole lot of work around how do you get an application in across all the different states and who signs on and who participates and how do we start to have these big conversations. And this is where DEEP, was really helpful in helping us understand what the ask was for EPA, when we should be, involved and at the table, what we should do after, because the federal EPA won't tell you to do much, right? So it will be incumbent on us as a state to think through how can DEEP, and HUD is at that table. There are at least 4 foundations at that table. There are nonprofits who heard this opportunity and care enough to follow the dollars. Mm-hmm. They're supposed to be $50 million. You want to follow that, right? So we want to follow that together, and we have been. Since the announcement came out in November of 2023, we have been meeting weekly as a group, and a shout out to some of my friends in the group who have really thought through how can we take this information and make sure it translates to those groups and those communities that need it the most, that have been underinvested in. What does that look like? And my wrap up there is we decided to do a webinar and put it out there for folks, and made sure that we reached out to Rob and reached out to the folks that are thinking through all of this at a state level to say, what should we be doing to make sure the communities we care about the most, make sure the money is going, make sure we're putting all the pressure. We had 160 folks sign up for that webinar, so that let us know that there's demand. People want to partner. There was even the registration process was a thoughtful process. It was, how do you think through the Department of Public Health launching a new initiative and needing partners? and us knowing the landscape of nonprofits who have ready projects that can fit. How do you start to do those matching? And that matchmaking is something that we're really leaning into, and I think it's a good example of how philanthropy and government and individuals can come together.
Okay. Great, thank you. I just want to pause to mention an initiative we have at DEEP that's ongoing that and I think DPH actually has something similar already underway, but that we could really use your expertise on, which is DEEP is starting what we're calling community resource hubs. And it's right now we have a draft request for qualifications out. We are hoping to establish 1 or 2 hubs as sort of pilots throughout the state. And the goal is really, when you mentioned applications, and sometimes people don't, where do you start with that? We're seeing the hubs as really an extension of DEEP in a sense where the goal is we're not funding sort of independent EJ initiatives through these hubs or anything like that, but to have better connections with communities throughout the state, and including training on applying for DEEP grants or spreading the word about DEEP grant opportunities, helping to get communities involved in our ongoing projects, or the fish stocking, or the hikes, or the cleanups, or spreading the news about our new environmental justice regulations. So, but we have a lot to learn from you, I think, about sort of partnerships, and we're hoping that people apply to be these hubs in partnerships with each other, so existing organizations. So we'll talk more with you about that. Yes. So back to Deputy Commissioner Morrissey. Can you talk a bit about sort of the pre-BIL and IRA and then post-BIL and IRA world? So how has that federal funding changed work at DPH, if at all? But I assume it has. And then sort of looking forward, any concerns or considerations for the future of federal funding?
Sure. And, I started talking about this a little bit earlier, and talking about how much funding we now have available and how different that looks in the landscape. So, there are a couple of different things in there. So one, you have the administrative challenge, because to go from an agency where you're talking $20–30 million, that's the whole, the whole kitty, to now over $700 million, the amount of staff that takes, not just the expertise from the engineers and the environmental analysts, but the administrative staff to get those contracts going. So that's one piece of it. The other piece that I would say is really the project prioritization and the way that the funding comes in. So one of the early lessons that I had, because I came from municipal government, and the nice thing about when you're in a municipality, when things don't go well, you go, well, there's the state. Like, why would the state do that? That doesn't make any sense, right? But now I'm the state, so I don't really get to say that anymore. So one of the first early lessons that I had, which really actually explained to me, like as a person who cut their teeth in municipal life, about how the funding comes into state agencies. So when I describe that over $700 million, I don't just get to do any water project that that anyone applies. That funding is carved out. Like, this percentage can go over to lead service line remediation. This amount of funding can come over to emerging contaminants such as PFAS, right? This amount of money can go to actual infrastructure projects, so like capital improvement. So what happens when you're going through this is that you got to start challenging your teams to get more creative, because the problems that municipalities have, the problems that the public water systems have, are fairly complex. So it's not just that they're trying to, update infrastructure that's been aging. They're trying to future-proof, right? They're thinking about how are we going to pay for getting this PFAS out? How do we leverage this funding that you have as a loan versus what do you have as subsidy, in the grant funding? And saying, well, why do we do it like that? And why is that carve out like that? And I'm still going to pretend that I'm new, because it's only been 2 years. So I always say to the team, well, why do we do it like that? I get to ask those questions and pretend like I don't know anything, and challenge the assumptions about how do we do these pieces, because really our goal is to make the funding more accessible to the communities who really need it. And part of that process, the other piece is that we didn't have a lot of funding for technical assistance beforehand. Now, again, in the 2 years, I was just like, I was just out in Manchester, and I've been here. You know, that's one of the nice things, you know, for the commissioner and I, that we're out on the ground. We're visiting communities. So I get to hear directly from the communities about the challenges. So when I come back and I say to the team, hey, I just was in Manchester, I was in Ledyard, I was in Colchester, and they're telling us that they can't even apply for funding because they don't even have the staff that they need to understand the application process. They don't know where to begin with a surveyor. They need all of these resources. What are we doing for technical assistance? How about we build out a technical assistance team to get the municipalities and the public water systems ready to apply, to help them do all of those pieces, to scope out what that project's going to look like. So what we've been doing is really kind of challenging ourselves in that and putting into place all of these technical assistance agreements, building out a technical assistance team. Because, you know, from my perspective, it's really the smaller systems, it's the disadvantaged communities are the ones that I worry most about being left behind, because they don't even have the resources to step up and make the applications for funding. So that's really like the big difference. So when we talk about the funding that we have and how we're utilizing it, I think being able to recognize that our small systems, our smaller communities, our disadvantaged communities, they need a leg up just to get to the table is a big deal, and being able to give them that, and that's one of the big pieces for me. And looking towards the future of where the funding is, I think that, you know, we're going to have to continue to be creative, you know, to work with our partners, to work with, you know, community organizations, to really think about, you know, if the funding from the feds trickles out, I can't imagine that we're going to have forever, right? All of this funding is going to keep coming. Like, how do we continue to keep this work going? How do we address the things, the very real challenges that we're all experiencing with climate change, increased regulations around emerging contaminants? There's more attention on these. The demands for municipalities and the public water companies are going to increase. The costs, we're never going to have enough money as a government agency to fulfill 100% of the demand. So how do we work together to really move forward with these things and leverage the funding that we do have so we can do the most good while we have it?
Yeah, I think the same fly was on our wall in the philanthropic sector. I mean, everything that you're saying about technical assistance and making sure that folks who have been behind and don't understand the changes to the landscape is such an important piece. I think we hear that for no matter the issue, pick an issue. Right. It is the same undercurrent for infrastructure needs. It is how do we make sure that folks have time, expertise, because these applications are open today, closed in 2 weeks, right? And you need letters, you need partnerships, you need plans, you need all of these things. So I'm so with you, and I think my role specifically at the council is about how do we build better public-private partnerships, because our money is not infinite either, right? And how are we more strategic, and how can we really address the things that we've all been working to address, and that's community input and making sure folks have what they need to build capacity for social justice.
The time has flown by, and so we're actually at the Q&A portion. So we have about 5 minutes to take questions, and so I'll start with whoever's hand goes up first.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this panel today. I have a micro question on a macro issue. You're talking about equity and infrastructure, and infrastructure is a big thing that somebody's got to build. We're talking about a town or a city that needs to actually have this infrastructure. The micro question is, it takes somebody to actually install and operate that infrastructure. Going back to the opportunities of equity for being those people that build or operate that. Of the funding that you've received, is there any funding to be afforded to those that actually either build these infrastructure projects or operate like the water systems afterwards? Is there any way that funding can be afforded to employers that are awarded these projects? Thank you.
Great question. So I'll take, you're right. macro problem, micro question. So this one is a little bit interesting, so because it goes back to what I was saying, how the funding comes in and how it gets, you know, carved out, how we can use it. One of the things that we've done at DPH is take a step back and, for example, to the water infrastructure and the certified water operators is where I think you were going with that. While I may not have the funding available in the money that comes in for the state revolving fund for that, I do have funding that comes in elsewhere in the Agency for Workforce Development and for addressing health equity post-COVID-19. And when you talk about taking a step back, and you're talking about, you know, to one of the questions that Annie asked earlier about how do you define equity in those pieces, we actually started using our funding that we got in other areas of DPH to address things like that. So we do a carve out right now where we're developing a program to address the workforce shortage that public water systems are facing in that piece. So very real and tangible. I mean, because the point that you're getting at is really great, because what you're talking about is addressing not just the physical infrastructure, but addressing the problem 360 degrees to understand that it's about the investment in the community, the people that live in that community, they want to work in their community, they want to serve in their community, and what role does government play in making those investments, because that goes back to equity, right? So similarly, part of that same package, we also did a financial investment into, we did an agreement with the Department of Education to do investment into the middle school and high school system, right? To address the education that students are receiving so that they're getting more math and science, so they qualify to sit for these things coming out of high school, because one of the challenges that we saw was that the pass rates for a lot of the certifications weren't as high as we wanted after the pandemic, because the students are at home and the math and science was a little lacking. I don't want to beat up on anyone, but so it was just like, okay, what can we do as public health in this? And I'm like, oh, well, we have equity money that we could use for that, and I can make the connection about doing this investment in education and how that translates to workforce development and how that translates to this other piece. So I think that's a really valid point that you bring up, because again, we have to be really creative about the solutions that we need to some of these really complex problems.
Yeah, so true. And one of the things that in the philanthropic sector, we hear your question, and we're thinking about, what does DPH think? What does the Office of Workforce Strategies think? What does the ECBD, right? Like, we start to kind of think through and do the outreach and start to try to connect the dots. Talk to workers, we talk to employers. What are they saying? We look at data. If there's no data, we think about, do we need to commission that? A couple of our community foundations just to put together some labor data, and, you know, who's using it, where the gaps are still. You know, I love this thought about going back to the schools. I mean, it's the pipeline work. We know we're an aging state, so a lot of folks are starting to get the importance of bringing young people along for all our conversations that we're having, especially when it comes to equity. So agreed that there's work to be done. There has to be creativity when you are thinking about the restrictions you have here, and it shows up similarly in philanthropy. Sometimes people have restrictions based on geography. They have restrictions based on populations, right? They have all those things. So we can get very creative about knitting all these pieces together to actually tell a fuller story, and that's where funders collaboratives come into play. And when we have those collaboratives, we would invite, you know, Lisa to tell us about the things that she's working on, and we kind of think about where we can match up and move forward together. So, great question.
I think we are going to have to wrap up, but I could meet up outside to chat after if anyone wants to chat. And thank you so much to our panelists and to Rob for bringing us here today to talk.
Thank you.